What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are back with another draft breakdown for the Detroit Lions, and today we're mixing it up a little bit. We're diving into the back of this year's draft with the receiver out of North Carolina. I forgot his name. Oh my, Antoine Green. So let's get it started. Welcome, everybody, to our video. Glad you guys are here. That was bad. That was, just act like that didn't happen. You know, because look, I've done this intro a few times. Act like that didn't happen. Yes, we're diving back into these draft breakdowns. Now, I understand this is probably taking a little bit longer than it has in years past, but I think that's a good thing. We're just giving more detail, and we're really getting a good sense, at least I think, of what I think about the player, what maybe he's good at, what maybe I don't think he's so great at, just what he's going to bring to the table for the Lions and how that's going to play out. I had a little bit of an idea of who this player was. My first impression, of course, was the Notre Dame game where he had like 3 receptions for 150 yards. So when that's your first impression, you're like, oh, okay, he's a deep threat. And then you just look at the statistics this past season. 18.6 yards per reception. 2021, 19.7 yards per reception. You look at that weird year, I think it was in 2019, 217 yards on 8 receptions. That's 27 yards per reception. I mean, I see that, I'm thinking Marvin Hall. That's exactly what I'm thinking. But he's in a different type of body, right? A bigger receiver. His position in general is just very intriguing heading into the draft because right before the draft, we found out about the Jameson Williams suspension as well as the Quintez Cephas, and we wondered if it could have changed up the Lions, you know, maybe mindset going into the draft. It didn't seem to, but they did select one there at the very beginning of round 7 after making some trades and landing with that draft pick at 219. So I'm not going to say I directly think this was because of the Jameson Williams suspension, but I do think that it's an absolute opportunity. I mean, a lot of times, you know, these guys this low in the draft class, it's tough to crack the roster in any way. One thing I will say is that when you look at how it's been in the preseason, the Lions seemingly have really valued how a player performs in the preseason. So there's going to be a real opportunity there. But because Quintez Cephas and the Jameson Williams suspension, because of those things taking place, I do think there is an opportunity to potentially get snaps maybe early in the season for the Lions because he's a big body that brings speed, and he could be a deep threat for the Lions. Like, there's opportunity there, while also if he can stick around, maybe continue to develop. I understand he's an older prospect, but he just hasn't been an extremely productive prospect until really 2 years ago in 2021. So I definitely think there's room to grow, and there's certain things that he can do, which I don't think you can necessarily teach. It may not all be there right now, but there's reasons to be excited about this player. And man, there was a couple of the little things that I just really liked about him when I was watching him. And actually, some of it I think popped up more when I went back and started looking at 2021. But with all that being said, don't want to waste more time. I'm going to dive right into this. Who is Antoine Green? As I mentioned, he's a little bit of an older receiver. He's a 5th-year senior coming out, 23 years old. Before we get into these testing scores, I do think it is interesting. I think there's a lot of similarities to when Marvin Jones Jr. came out of the draft back in, I believe it was 2013. He was a 5th-round pick. 2012, he was a 5th-round pick, so he was a later pick as well, 166. But when you just look at some of the ways that he measured and some of the ways that he tested, I do think there were some similarities here to Antoine Green, maybe to put some things into perspective. So you can see the testing scores. I won't read those off. I'll read off Marvin Jones Jr. and you can compare those to Antoine Green. So Marvin Jones Jr. ran a 4.46, which is essentially the same 40 time. His 10-yard split was exactly the same as Antoine Green. Now, the vertical and the broad jump weren't great for Marvin Jones Jr. He didn't test out extremely well in the explosive scores, posting a 33-inch vertical, which is a little bit shorter than Antoine Green. And then you take a look at some of the agility scores, and Marvin Jones Jr. tested out a little bit better there. And then, of course, the measurables, a 6'0", 1.6", 199 receiver in Antoine Green versus Marvin Jones, who is 6'0", 1.7", 199. That's super similar. And then even if you go to arm length, for example, you have slightly longer arms there for Marvin Jones Jr., 33 1/8, versus a guy like Antoine Green who's looking at 32.25-inch arms. So I think there's a lot of similarities there in terms of the way that they tested out. And then, of course, you can also look at the hand size, a little bit smaller there for Antoine Green. I do think that pops up a tad. He's got smaller hands at only 9 inches versus 10 inches for Marvin Jones Jr. But I think if you just want to kind of think of a body type, think of Marvin Jones Jr., he kind of falls right into that class. Find a role that they fit in well. Going back to Marvin Hall, he had a role and he did it well. So with that being said, you look at some of the production these past couple of years. Last year was cut short because he only played in 9 games. The beginning of the season, he was out with a collarbone injury that was suffered in a fall camp. So he didn't return until the Notre Dame game, which they were hopeful that he would. And I guess some of them were actually impressed that he was able to get back that fast. And even in that game, I believe he was a little bit on and off the field, kind of working his way back into it. Still, he posted 3 receptions for 150 yards. One of them, there was a coverage breakdown. Still posted 43 receptions for almost 800 yards, 7 touchdowns, nearly, like I said, 18.6 yards per reception. And then you can see his career stats. And if you notice, the career numbers aren't huge. Essentially missed a couple of years because of the unfortunate ankle injury. So I guess that's another part of the reason why, the production may have been a little bit of a late bloomer there for Antoine Green. But by the way, I loved it. There was someone was holding a sign at one of their games said MEGA-TOINE. I thought that was fire. So I don't know if that's like a thing that we is that like real nickname? Maybe he has a nickname. I think his like social media is just like Twine, so it's understandable. But the MEGA-TOINE I thought was fire, and then the thing like, oh, we had MEGA-TOINE. So I'm not trying to compare him to MEGA-TOINE. I'm just saying I thought it was fire. I was like, oh, MEGA-TOINE. Okay, I rock with that. So let's go through the receiving side here for Antoine Green, and we're gonna start with the release first, and I'll try to fly through some of my notes, not touch on everything, but just some of the main things that I took away. And this is an era where I think he's a guy that could be even better than he is right now. I think he can become more efficient in this area. There's real ways that he can improve in terms of winning off the release. For him, I think he wins a little bit more with that speed than he does with some of the agility or the explosiveness. But I think he can win with more efficiency, more discipline at the line of scrimmage, continue to improve in this area. But I do have a couple of examples that I want to showcase of different ways that I thought he's already shown that he can win specifically this past year off the line of scrimmage. But I will point out that one thing I do like, and I know we've talked about a lot with JMO, because I think Brad Holmes actually said it like, oh, this guy dictates coverage. And I'm not saying to that level necessarily that Antoine Green will, but I think he can affect sometimes, depending on your matchup, how you think about how you want to play this guy. For example, there seemed to be an awareness, certain teams that they would play. There was communication between him and the quarterback pre-snap. How did the safeties roll? Was it one-on-one coverage? Was the cornerback pressing up without safety help? You didn't get a lot of teams that would do that against Antoine Green. One example was Pittsburgh back in 2021 against their top corner. Now, you could argue he kind of tripped a little bit here. It's one of the things that I do like is that he has ready hands to counter off the release. Feel like he could be a little more proactive in spots to get off a little bit quicker, but he does have ready hands to counter off the line of scrimmage when he comes to balance. That way he can continue with his release. But that was an example where they didn't have safety over top. He was able to get off the line of scrimmage, and where he's threatening is when he does get a step, when he does get even with the cornerback. He's able to stack from there. He quickly becomes the guy that can stack over top without safety help if you're going to press him as a corner. Now, that's not to say he consistently beats press coverage, but he can do that. I think he's better at attacking the bail coverage and the off coverage, things that I think he sees a little bit more. I think he's just better at doing that. But again, that is something that I feel like defenses were aware of. So it is one of the benefits and one of those things that definitely could be beneficial going forward into the league if he gets more efficient here off the line, that could show up even more. But I did feel like there was a real awareness of like, okay, hey, do we have one-on-one here? Do we really want to press in the spot depending on who we have matched up against? I'm going to show you guys some examples. I think both of these are going to be against Virginia. Just a couple of different releases that he showed. I did the same thing in the Marvin Jones Jr. video, so I thought it would just make sense to kind of do a similar thing here. A couple of different ways that I saw him win. He loves the hesitation releases. You'll see some skip releases. You'll see him drag the back foot on some of these releases, especially inside the 20. Against inside leverage, he likes to go to that fade route. They'll run a lot of those inside the 20. For example, inside 20 is where maybe you don't need safety help over top because the end zone's in the way. But with that being said, a couple of different examples. So the first one shows the quickness, his foot quickness. This is real. He has real foot quickness. He can win with foot quickness, and this is an area of upside to me because you'll see, like, for example, some of the foot fire release wins that he has. There's an example here with the foot fire release. You see him firing his hands, his feet, everything's moving, and then also having that foot quickness to win. So Virginia, the cornerback, gives him some space at the line of scrimmage. He's not getting up and stabbing him right off the line. And then you see some of that foot fire quickness, hands, feet, everything involved, and then he's able to threaten the leverage, jab, and go. So that was one example of a way that he can win off the release. And then you get another example with more of the hesitation release, which he likes to go to a ton. Here's an example of a hesitation single release. He pushes off that back foot. Got to come to balance. I think sometimes you'll get him kind of rushing this, for example, and that's an area where I think efficiency could be improved upon. It looks like some of these hesitation releases, he kind of rushes through it. You'll see his body weight start to kind of lean to where he wants to go, and I think that gets him into problems, especially when he's going to some of the outside releases like a fade, because a lot of times with these hesitation outside releases, you could set up the inside to win, right? So cornerbacks, especially inside leverage, like, oh, I got to protect that. Now you can get me on the fade. But for him, not only, number one, I think getting too wide where it slows him down, allows the cornerback back into the play, but also at the same time, rushing through it, I think sometimes a little bit quickly. He starts to sort of lean his body weight to where he's going. The hips start to go that direction. Cornerback then gets on top of the route, I want to believe, and based on the quickness that he does showcase, sometimes he looks way quicker than other plays, and I think that's a little bit of an issue. I really believe that he might be quicker planting off his right foot and driving upfield. Great timing off the ball, off the line of scrimmage. You love that. Shows up on speed releases. If he gets off coverage, sometimes bail, but really if he's running a speed route, you really see the juice, and it's like, whoa, that he has that, and then that release looked like that. You're like, why does it look so much different? I think there's just efficiency things that need to be cleaned on here. Like I said, I think he gets too wide sometimes. I think other times he rushes through the release. You do see the ability to win with single steps and just go. The speed releases, that's where I feel like he's honestly at his best, because there's not a lot to it. Just like get off the line and go, and you just start to see some of the athleticism sort of pour out into what he's capable of. Love the ready hands to counter, especially, I mean, you see this throughout the entire route, but he's ready to counter, and you'll see that a lot of times when a cornerback comes up, tries to press him, give him a quick little jam or stab off the line with one hand, you'll see the ready hands. That way he can continue through his release and he doesn't get like held up there. He also is a little bit of a bigger receiver, so he shouldn't have a ton of that issue of just being like, oh, he's out muscled here. Even though I don't think his route strength is maybe the best, I do think that doesn't show up as much as issue, especially when he comes to balance. It's not really an issue, but he shows those ready hands. And again, that example was an example of cornerback goes down and you see sort of, the hand usage there, the ready hands to counteract some of the stab. You got it against Notre Dame when he got over top, beat the quick stab. So he has that. I think he could be a little bit more proactive in terms of getting a little bit quicker through that process with the hand usage, but they are ready, right? He's ready to fend off and he's ready to continue through his release. Just one thing I think right now as a whole, I think he's just more consistent winning the inside releases where he can really shoot forward into those releases, try to gain a step than he is on the outside. I think sometimes, again, he takes wide angles or you don't see some of that burst upfield. And then this is maybe an example of where you see him kind of fade at the top of the route. Even some of the underneath, like quick 4-yard, 5-yard hitches, we'll talk about this a little bit later, you'll see him kind of stumble into sitting down, and that can throw off the timing of the route a little bit. Again, I think it's a little bit high too. The big thing for me is he doesn't have a ton of shake, right? And we'll talk about this a little more about the route running. I don't think he has a ton of the agility, and you'll see that sometimes he struggles to get outside and of a cover 2 corner. The guys that can kind of sit in his way through that phase of the route, it seems to have issues getting around it. I don't think he has a ton of the shake or the agility, and he's not as explosive as maybe I expected with some of like the first step. So the efficiency, I think, has to get cleaned up there, and I think a great person to look at is Marvin Jones Jr. Even some of the wide releases, like outside and inside that he ran, they just looked a little bit like he was just kind of doing it, but it didn't look clean. It didn't look like super efficient for the next level. But then you watch Marvin Jones do it, and you're like, oh, that looks really good. I think he's a guy that's going to be really good for him to kind of learn from and be like, okay, let's get this thing just a little bit more dialed in than it is. But that's just kind of my take on it, honestly. I think there's real upside there. Now, working into more of the route running as a whole, sort of the stem of the route, and this is where I like a lot of things for him. Again, talking about the off coverage, the bail coverage that he sees, I think he's good there. What you love is the way that he alters the pace of the route, the speed early in the route. You see it against Notre Dame, and it can be very subtle, just altering, the speed of a route. That way he can get over top. This shows up a ton against off coverage when he gets shot plays over top, because now he doesn't have to worry about the release. He's already kind of moving his feet. You see it against bail coverage too. He's not having to worry about combating or fighting anybody off, so his feet are already moving. He has those quick feet, and then he's able to really pace it out, and he's a strider, man. So once he gets rolling, he can kind of slow down, and then he can hit you and then just go by you, get you flat-footed and go. And he does a lot of that, altering speed, changing speed, that kind of thing. He uses that acceleration to just take off. Here he is against some of that bail against Duke here, and you can see how he kind of releases out at like a second gear, and then as he gets even and fully into the blind spot, he hits that third gear, and that's when he runs by. Maybe not the best coverage here, but there's an example of him attacking. Against Notre Dame, breaking into the back of the end zone, how he can kind of try to slow play that, and he can just turn on the gas, and you see that instant acceleration that he has to just kind of open up, create space, and then, that's an opportunity for a lot of catch and run. And they used him on some of those drags like we saw against the blitz, or maybe just on third down and long like we did that in 2021 when some of our pass protection was an issue, trying to get some of those catch and run opportunities, set blockers in front, and they did some of those types of routes to him, just kind of speaking to some of that acceleration I think that they believe that he had. But it's the subtle angle changes that you like when he's attacking off coverage. His eye discipline, this is a big part. While some of the things I think break loose a little bit, I love the eye discipline. You see it here on this double move against Virginia Tech, really getting to bite, and he does this through pretty much every route. He does a great job of really looking off where he wants to go. So if receivers looking at his eyes, trying to break maybe from more so off coverage, that's when you see that he's able to sell his routes pretty well. Like the most as a route runner is more so attacking the zone coverage, and this is like level 1, sometimes level 2. The ability to attack zone coverage, middle of the field. He has a great feel for hitting zone windows. There was a weird example, and I don't know what this was, but it was like the two receivers actually high-fived each other on the way by. I don't know what that was. That just stood out to me. Maybe it was for timing or something. It was against NC State when they both ran drags, but the point is I think he has a really good feel for finding those open holes in zone, and then you also see the way that he creates space late in plays. I've heard some things from Lions, camps that he's shown some of that ability, but it's real, like the ability to kind of flow late in plays, create separation, understanding the play design. You talk about those football intelligence guys, right, how we've brought a lot of those in. I think this is another player that fits into that. But a lot of this probably comes from experience in that sense, but just the understanding of like, all right, the play design's here. How can I create space? How does the zone, where's the holes in the zone coverage? And then also not staying, stationary, right? If someone's in his way, kind of floating himself open. I think Marvin Jones does a great job of that, making a quarterback your best friend. You see it late in the play as the play broke down. You saw it for Sam Howell. That was a good example there, the way he was kind of breaking back and forth on the sideline. He's like, hey, go, and then come back. And, that's what he does. Like, he just finds ways to create space as the play kind of wears on. Lacks a little bit of the lateral movement skills to avoid contact, as I touched on some of those cover 2 corners. Just getting around those guys in general, I thought was a little bit of an issue at time. Kind of ties back to some of the release. I talked about, I like how he's able to attack, the half turn coverage, the bail coverage from a press bail sort of position for a cornerback. I love how he attacks that. You saw it against Miami. Tyreek Stevenson, the one big shot he had in that game was on one of the top corners. I think the Bears took him. Tyreek Stevenson, on that post route, is really good at attacking a half turn style cornerback. And again, that's a lot of the reason why he gets those shots, because it's not just pure he's running the 4-2 and running by everybody. A lot of corners run a 4-4-7, right? What he ran, but it's the subtle speed changes that he takes at the top of the route as he's working through the route, and I think it's more efficient when he's able to open up on some of those longer routes, a little bit more linear routes, because he's able to already keep that speed rolling, and he's able to kind of shift from there, and that's where you kind of get him shifting gears as he's working through the route, which makes it difficult to stick with him. Like, this is a good example of things that I like about his game, maybe some things that I don't love about his game, but you see that change of speed here. He's going to threaten over top. He's going to turn on the gas. Now, notice he has to pick himself up a little bit to try to sink down. It takes a couple of extra steps to beat that drum, but then he slides into the zone hole that the ball is thrown into, and he's able to create space for this reception. What I don't like as a route runner is the way that he sort of tends to lean through his routes. That was the biggest thing for me. I thought he would lean through routes a little bit. He lose bursts out of tight breaks. Sometimes you get some of those double moves, and it's more so some of the quick double moves that they asked of him, where it was like plant here, 2 steps, then plant back the other way. Like those kind of things, I thought you lost a lot of speed out of them. He does rise a little bit when he's going into a break. I think the thing is, I think he's a little bit stiff in the lower body. I think he's a little bit stiff. He's not as flexible at bending at the knees, he's not the type of player that when you watch him run like a quick hitch route or a quick curl route 10 yards down the field, where it's like, oh, he just slams on the brakes and he's right back there for the receiver. Maybe that's more of a technical thing that can be improved upon, but it takes him multiple steps to break down top of the route. A lot of times he has to kind of reposition himself. Sometimes you'll see him fall down trying to make some of those breaks. I've seen that multiple times where he's fell down. One was reception, one he just fell down. Ball didn't go his direction. I think he's just a little bit tight in the lower body, but then you see that on some of those route breaks where he kind of rises up to sink into those route breaks. It doesn't come back as an issue, but you always think like the discipline to be more important in the NFL, tighten things up. Sometimes he gets off coverage, doesn't show up as much, but he does lean a little bit, I think, at times into where he's breaking the route, and then cornerbacks can kind of get a step ahead of it, and they can get a little bit of a sense of where he's going, or at least the fact that he is going to break in the route. And then when he does sink down, you see kind of the lack of sink and then explode out. He does lose legitimate speed when he's trying to make those crisp cuts and then cut back the other direction. That's why I think he's much better on those, deep posts, those routes that can be drawn out where it's a little bit looser. He could be a little bit wider with it. That's where I think he's much better. It's when he has to get those hard angles, we have to sit down, plant, keep speed. Like, that's where I feel like you see issues, which is going to make it difficult for him to consistently shake coverage at the first first and second level. More specifically, I think the second level, to consistently shake coverage clean there is going to be a little more a problem. I think it also throws off his route strength as well. Like some of the balance there gets thrown off because, again, I think there is a little bit of a lack of flexibility in the lower body. So sometimes it feels like he can get kind of pushed around and just lose his balance at times. What I like about attacking half turn coverage, to kind of point back to that for a second, is kind of the subtle late lean. You saw it against Virginia on the post route. I think he's a speed route monster. I didn't see him used here as much as I thought they could have, especially in 2021, but I think this is where he can become an animal because he can get off he can run those speed routes, speed release, just kind of go. His angles may drift a little bit, like you'll see it when he's coming out of a break, for example, to maintain speed. Sometimes it's not always the most precise, like 90-degree angle in an out route. It may turn into it fades a little bit up, but what you like is how fast he flies through those, so he can kind of adapt to it. He gets through it quickly. It backs off coverage corners. If you're running some of the RPO action, we did a couple of times last year, some of those quick hitting slants against off coverage. If you see that, the quarterback can quickly get through the process and just put it out there. Even though sometimes I don't think he always stays to the line, sometimes they seem to kind of float off a little bit. You just love how fast he's able to roll through those types of routes. He's a level 1 zone beater, level 2 zone beater. Like that's an area where he's very effective, is the way that he finds a way to get open. Ideal route depth, ideal break points in terms of the timing there. He understands the route designs I touched on, and then he's just crafty, altering tempo, vertical, using his hands at the top of the route, and the transition into that. We look at the South Carolina play from 2021. He's breaking this post, and you like how he has the active hands. You see him kind of throw his hand, and then he starts to sort of lean into the cornerback here. He's able to create space at the top of the route. He's not even looking to push off, right? I think he's just trying to close that distance, show his hand. Cornerback then throws his hand, then he leans into that, and then he's able to create that space. He's able to maintain speed as he's going through it, and then slowly but surely he gets on top of the route, and then he breaks back inside. Like that was a cool example against South Carolina, but I really like him in that sense, the way that he uses his hands. Great foot quickness to stop and start the foot fire, that kind of thing, as he slowly works his way in some of those releases, but he has some of that stop and start foot quickness to allow him to open up some of those double moves. Comes to just pass catching, right, making the play on the football. There are things to like and things I think to necessarily not like here. His hands, I think they grew on me a little bit as I watched him. You get some drops, you're like, ah, dang, I wish I didn't see that. But so I don't think he has like elite hands, but I also don't think he has poor hands either. I think where did I grade him at? You'll see at the end. Basically speaking, though, some of the notes that I had here, the field presence, I think that's very quickly something that you're made aware of. I think there's a great example. You see it against Clemson. He's running this corner route. The field presence where he kind of just, he stops on his, it's almost like he just powers off and he's like, I'm not running out of bounds. He just kind of falls down with it. There's a field presence, but there's also an urgency, and we'll talk about this more in run after catch, but it's the field awareness. Where do I need to get? What landmarks do I need to hit? And then staying there. Oh, I'm on the sticks. Okay, let me stay there. Let me not run past it. Like, there's a real field sense that he plays with as a receiver, which you love. A pass catcher, I like his scoop pass catching technique when he has to really go down and scoop it up off the turf. He has pretty good body control. The tracking ability, you saw it against Miami off the tip. Uses it well with his body. You see it on some of the deep shots, the way that he kind of positioned himself. He does a really good job positioning himself on deep shots at the catch point, using his body with his hands to make the reception. But you do get the tendency to kind of trap the ball in his chest instead of plucking it. For example, NC State 2021, you see it in the end zone. Underneath, he works well back to the football. But that's the big thing, is like, you will get a guy that will kind of trap the ball underneath instead of plucking it with his hands. With the underneath technique, it's a little bit more of like a scoop and then trap it into my chest. It makes sense, especially on some of the lower passes, but you do get the occasions of where it kind of just slides off. That can happen because he's using a little bit more of his body. Again, remember, he doesn't have the biggest hands. I think that does play into it. Speaking on some of the field sense and field awareness, the toe tapping, I think that's there. Though I think at times it can lack a little bit early in the route before the catch point. He seems to be aware of, okay, I gotta get my feet down. But I think sometimes it can also on him, I think at times, finding, okay, where's the sideline, being aware of that when there's contact, when he's playing through contact, when he's battling someone, but also having to stay really disciplined with where his feet are. That can show up as something that pops up a little bit, getting 1 foot down consistently. Obviously, you need 2 down in the NFL. You saw it on the over-the-shoulder drop against Pitt. Like, that was one that was like, oh, he's capable of catching that. However, I will say on those passes, I think the tracking can be a little bit hit and miss. First off, the depth of the route, there are times where it looks like he just completely underruns it, like he's kind of anticipating it not to be as far as it is, and then the ball gets a little bit further, gets a little bit on top of him, and it's like he was just a little bit off from it. But also, I think the tracking getting thrown off in terms of where he places his hands to make the reception. You'll see the ball kind of get up on his shoulder at times. Placement for pass catching can be a little bit hit and miss. Sometimes looks like his hands are just a little bit off, and he's like trapping the side of the football, and you'll see it ultimately, it'll like end up on his forearms. The example against Virginia, I think that was one where you see him kind of catching and tucking, trying to in one motion, but he's not securing that pass catch. I think sometimes just his hand placement is very important. I think sometimes you get hit and miss with that, but I thought he had good technique overall with some of the overhand, over the head, over his frame, plus hand-eye coordination. I love his concentration, even though I said sometimes I think, you know, you get some mishaps in terms of where's my foot placement along with playing through the contact, but what you do like is you like the concentration to keep battling through the catch. You know, if a guy's hanging all over him, he's still going to battle. He doesn't seem to ever lose concentration. He's locked in through the plate. That doesn't mean he catches everything contested, but he does play through those contested situations. Where you do see is some of the smaller hands, the ball can get jarred a little bit loose as he's working it towards his body. If his hands don't get on properly initially to the catch, he doesn't have the strongest hands always away from his body, and as he's trying to pull it in, sometimes they can knock it and jar it loose. But with that being said, I love the concentration. The hand-eye coordination is real. Like, there's quick, fast reactions that you see when you watch him. He just doesn't have the biggest hands. But as I said, at the top of the route, the way that I love that he uses those subtle movements to create space. You know, we talked about that a lot about Quintez Cephas when he came out, but this is something that's really there. Like, I didn't get to see him call for one OPI. You will get some DPIs even when he's not getting some reception, so, you know, the stats don't take that into account. Like, some of those subtle movements, the subtle push-offs at the top of the route, creating separation. He positions himself really, really well. Toughness, like, that's a huge part. As I said, he works back to the ball underneath. He becomes the quarterback's best friend. But I love the toughness, man. Like, he is fearless. He'll attack with the safety, you know, coming down to hit him. His concentration just doesn't shake at all. I never see his concentration shake. Doesn't mean he doesn't drop passes. I just see him always locked in on the football, regardless if the guy's hanging on my back, regardless if I'm about to take a big hit. Dude had a collarbone injury. He was out for the rest of the game because he took the big hit over the middle, but you still see that he made that reception. Like, that was an example. He is a tough player, and I think that's something that has to be brought up, and that ties in again with the ball tracking. Like, his ability to maintain, his ability to pick up speed as he's tracking the ball downfield is awesome. I just at times think he misplaced some of the depth of it. Against Virginia Tech maybe have been an example of that, but what you do like is he's consistently really good with high pointing, the timing, when to leave the ground, when to jump. He's very good at high pointing. Some guys, they jump really early, and it's like, okay, now he's coming down the ball, so he doesn't get at his highest point. Other times, they jump late, they get their hands up late, right? We've talked about that before. He is a really good job of high point timing. And then finally, that transitions into the run after catch. And I was shocked. I want to say I was shocked. I was surprised. Didn't expect him to be this good in this area. I gave him one of my highest grades as run after catch. I just didn't anticipate that there was going to be much here. But then you start to see some of the creativity, kind of the field sense, and you're like, oh, wow, he can actually do some things after the catch. And I think you could put a highlight reel together of like 8-9 plays of like, that's a really nice run after catch situation. He has plus contact balance. You look at the Duke game, you look at the NC State slant, the way that he plays through contact, the balance that he showcases. Sometimes he's toe tapping sidelines. He is urgent. Very urgent. So as I said, hitting landmarks, speed outs. He's not there to get 4 yards and run out of bounds. He's there to get that and it's quickly, as fast as he can, get to the 10 yards and pick up that first round. There's an urgency that he plays with as soon as the ball hits his hand to hit those landmarks if he needs to. Other times he'll lean more on the possession side, but there's an urgency to him to flip, spin out. He has a feel for where the first defender is very quickly. You'll see it against zone coverage. He feels run lanes, right? Level one. He's not just satisfied with his catch. He kind of senses there's a guy to my right, guy to my left. I can get upfield. Quick turn, get upfield. Like, there is a sense, there's a field sense with him to immediately react quickly. But then that transitions into when the ball's in his hands. There's some creativity. I thought he would have had a little bit more burst immediately off the catch. At times, I think there's a little bit of a loss of speed in terms of it's not like always as quick as you would like. Some of those drags, I thought he left a little bit to be desired because he was able to separate and run away from guys, but then it wasn't like he was taking off after the catch. But with that being said, there's an instinctive feel. Pass catcher, what you like is he's very quick to say, get that out of the air, pull it down, because I know that I don't have the biggest or strongest hands inside the frame. Get it to my frame quickly. But then it's those fast reactions, and the guy is crafty with the ball in his hands. Of course, he's got that big time speed. Times it looks like he kind of wears down, but I don't think that'll be an issue because, you know, he's not going to be like a starting outside receiver immediately for us. But I was really impressed by what he was able to do run after catch. And then the final last couple of notes that I had as a blocker, I thought he did a really good job with block positioning. It showed up quickly against Virginia Tech on the screen. The way that he positioned himself early, the effort was real. He positioned himself well. You saw it against Duke. He gets under the pads, but I don't like he seems to put his head down. Maintaining connection can be a little bit of an issue, but he does position himself originally really well. So I think that's going to translate. Sometimes I would like to see the competitiveness ramp up a little bit. Like, go try to knock someone off, you know, like go push someone back. But I like how he positions himself, and I do think there's an eagerness. He's not a guy that just sits back and watches things happen. He seems to be aware of what's happening. There was a good example of that where he looked for work. You saw it against Wake Forest, right? There was a screen that could have been set up. He didn't get the ball thrown that way to block, and he's had to lead block, so that'll help because we got guys that we can throw him to. He can lead block, but the running back ended up getting ball, and he broke off from where he was supposed to be for the screen to go try to lay a block. It wasn't like the prettiest block, but it was just the fact that he had a mindset of like, I'm going to go pick up a block. I love that, right? And he's a high FBI player in that sense, really, that I think is tough, and he looks for work as a blocker, and that was a good example. Again, also his hands get wide. He puts his head down, his hands get wide. His technique sometimes look like he's trying to tackle people, and you're like, ooh, that doesn't look right. He like gets around their back. The technique doesn't always look great, but I do like the effort that's there, and that's really the biggest thing. So that's some of my main notes. I'm going to throw this last screen up, and what this is what I usually talk about at the end. I'm like, okay, and I said it different. It's not exactly how I grade, but it is just kind of an example. Just guys, give you guys something to look at. I'm not going to go through it all, but maybe just a little bit of okay, this is kind of what he's thinking. So you can see there, the blue squares, how far I have them filled in is basically my grade that I gave to him. There's 9 squares, so it's out of 9. You can see the 5 categories: pass catching, route running, run after catch, blocking / toughness, and then the football intelligence / clutchness. And he's a clutch player. 2 clutch plays. I can't remember the second one off the top of my head. The other one was back of the end zone. It was a touchdown grab, sent it to overtime. The other one I'm forgetting for some reason, but he was clutch. Now, he didn't always go. Now, they didn't always like say, hey, get him on the field, we're running the route for him, but he showed up when his number was called upon. And I did like that. Like, he was there for the moment, man. This is a clutch player for sure. First downs, landmarks, clutch, fighting for the first down. I love the one where he didn't get it, but the way that he came back for the ball, caught it, spun out, and then he just fought his way. He ended up his knee touched the ground. They were out short, so they punted. But that's what I was like, oh, I love that. I absolutely love that. So that's an area that I really like him. His pass catching, you could see there, I gave him a slightly above average grade personally there with pass catching. I think there's things to like. I think it's better than average as pass catcher, but I don't think he's in that elite category for sure. Route running, I think, is the area where I like him the least right now. There's definitely, I think, an ability to dictate coverage. I like how he attacks off coverage. Got the change of pace ability, and he's able to get over top. That's the biggest thing, because you can't just win by being 4.47 fast. Like, that's nowhere near the fast receiver in football. But the way that he changes speed, the way that he alters tempo, the subtle angle changes, that's why he's tough over top. Outside of that, though, separating consistently first, second level against man may not be there. If he can win off the release more consistently, that could open up a little bit more. His route strength, I think, was average to below average, and I think there's balance issues that come, and then I think he lacks a little bit of flexibility there. Run after catch, again, pleasantly surprised. This is one of my highest grades that I gave him there. I gave him a 6, you can see on that one. And then my blocking and toughness, it's another area where I really liked him, man. This is a tough player. He gets back from injuries. You can just see the toughness. And he also seemed to be a guy that, you know, teammates liked. How about MEGA-TOINE? We see you, MEGA-TOINE. Grade him from watching him. Again, nothing really hits the elite category for me when watching him outside of the ability to get over top. Like, that's real, and I think it can translate. You have to be able to play into that role, clean up some of the other things. That way you can hopefully be more of a versatile target. But could he flash in preseason with 2 big plays over top and then make a roster spot because of that? Yup. And hey, look, as we said, you have to be able to make big plays. So what kind of routes does your quarterback throw well? That kind of thing. This is a guy, I like him on those play action routes. We run him a lot with Khalif, you know, some of the deep, you know, posts. And a lot of times we don't throw. We'll have the post, we'll have the dig route. But he's the guy that I think you run some of those longer routes with that take time to develop, but he can ultimately separate. And the benefit that he has size. Like, a lot of times, like Khalif, we run those routes. There's not size there. So when you put it up, it's like, okay, you know, you really got to nail that throw. him being 6'1.5", 200 pounds, and still having that ability to get over top, that's going to be a real valuable asset, a much bigger target that you can aim for if you're trying to run those shot plays on the play action sets downfield. I think the rack is real because you can hit him on some of those, hey, look, they're showing blitz, let's throw a quick screen, quick bubble to him. There's football intelligence to understand things. I've heard, there was a little bit of like, oh, he aligned in the wrong place. Like, yeah, that thing's going to happen. But I think there was a real ability for him to be a threat to do that. And then he's also going to be able to attack zone coverage. So you run him on some of those drags underneath. If you run him on certain routes like that, I think we have one of our dig route guys and Marvin Jones Jr. that we just added, but you can run him on some of those underneath looks, especially against zone coverage. I think he's going to be able to attack zone coverage. The way that he works back to the football, first, second level, even third level, fights late in the play. That's kind of where I think his role could fall into place early. And then as he continues to develop, if he can clean up some of the route running, clean up some of the release, I think there's definitely a lot more on the bone that could be here, because I just like the way that he plays the game. So that's Antoine Green, the receiver out of North Carolina. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I'm out.